So hello and welcome to a special Christmas year in review edition of the MCC Brussels Podcast. I'm Jacob Reynolds, Head of Policy, and today really delighted to be joined, as we often are, by our Executive Director, Frank Fray.
Nice to be here.
And we're also excited to be joined by Joe Barnes, who's the Brussels correspondent for the Daily Telegraph.
Again, great to be here.
Oh, great. Well, it's been an incredibly busy year, and some of us here are sitting here after our wildly successful bumper Christmas party. So we've got a lot to dive into. But I think to start, Frank, one theme of the year, and we'll run through some events, but one theme of the year was the repeated farmer protests right across the year. And that's kind of driven a lot of EU politics. We've been involved in it quite heavily as well. What have you made of the kind of farmers' fight over the course of the year?
I think it's in many respects quite exemplary in that this was a movement that emerged quite spontaneously with very little organization, led by people with no political experience, but really fueled by their anger at the way in which their interest and their way of life has been attacked and their interest has been ignored. And what I find quite interesting is that although some concessions were made to them, it's evident when you talk to some of the people that were involved in the protests that they're looking forward to another wave of protests, maybe in the early part of next year, because they realize that they're being fobbed off. I think it's also worth noting that the protest has extended to Britain. And even in Britain now, you're beginning to get a lot of farmers reacting, particularly small farmers with small holdings. And I think that what's gradually happening is that in one way or the other, the politicization of green politics and the environment has led to a situation where the rural communities feel that they've become entirely expendable. And I think that's not going to go away anytime soon. So I expect a lot more reactions from the rural communities.
Yeah, and Joe, I mean, we'll get into later the kind of thumping that Green parties took in the EP elections, but it's kind of like in spite of the growing anger with green and environmentalist policies, the kind of the screw is still tightening, and that affects the farmers.
Yeah, and on one hand, you've got sort of the actual policy, and then on the other hand, I think what they feel is a traditional way of life being attacked. And you've got guys who have had, and girls who have had farms handed down generations after generation after generation. And then suddenly they realize that their way of life is actually coming to an end almost, whether it be because governments are trying to turn their people vegan or something like that. And it's a way of life that we all hold quite dearly. And like I covered numerous of protests in Brussels, and one of the signs that you often see attached to these tractors, and they are huge things, they're absolute beasts of machines, is like no food, no future. And actually they have a point that these guys and girls actually do an incredibly hard job. They're up at all hours. The other day, I think actually Clarkson's farmer, Jeremy Clarkson's done a great thing describing actually the hardships that farmers face. And that's with a guy with a Lamborghini tractor who's already a multimillionaire. Look at the guys that aren't actually making ends meet at times. And then you have that side of thing, and then you have it's these green policies, and we're coming to again it's sort of the age of globalism where we've had the EU's deal with Mercosur, all about bringing in more food from overseas, and it's just politicians forgetting about servicing their people at home, and actually should Belgian steaks or Belgian milk be served in Belgium, or should we all try and go to South America or the US to get our food when it's actually on the doorstep?
Yeah, and one of the ways that farmers have been demonized is with the far right label and trying to kind of just dismiss them as far right. But this has turned into a fever pitch this year, and this is the next thing I want to pick up on, is the repeated attacks right across Europe have really intensified on free speech and free assembly. Frank, I can barely believe it was this year, but we had maybe the case example par excellence when we were involved in the NatCon, which was shut down, or attempted to be shut down by the police. Could you reflect on that experience, which barely even feels like it was this year, I know, but and what that says about the broader state of free speech and free expression?
Yeah, I think it was very interesting that we organized a conference where we invited a lot of important conservative figures everybody from Prime Minister Orbán of Hungary to Nigel Farage to Wilders from Holland. And essentially we got cancelled because of a alleged security risk posed by the Antifa, the anti-fascist movement, in 3 different settings. In the end, we were very lucky that we managed to hold the fort in the 3rd assembly room. And even though the police came and tried to get rid of us, we basically locked the door. And we were quite determined that our right to freedom and free expression isn't going to be thwarted. But the thing that I learned from this is that there's a very kind of casual way in which freedom of speech is held. And I thought it was very interesting that in the end, the Prime Minister of Belgium had to make a statement decrying the fact that they would not allow us to have these conferences. But it's worth noting that before he made that statement, he had a lot of pressure from other leading politicians, including the Prime Minister of Britain, Rishi Sunak at the time, who asked the question, can't we have free speech in Belgium, freedom of assembly, what's happened here? So I thought it was quite interesting. On a personal note, I had a book launch organized, which was cancelled because allegedly it was too political, even though the bookshop has organized plenty of book launches that were political. Fortunately, we found a place for the same night. But the very fact that a book launch of a book that's essentially academic, a long academic book that isn't really going to set the world on fire and isn't agitating for revolution, can be seen as a threat, and the author could be shut down without a second's hesitation, indicates that for a lot of people, the question of free speech exists only at the rhetorical level, but in terms of any commitment to it, it's paper thin.
No, and Joe, I mean, since you've been in Brussels, you'll have seen plenty of examples like this, but maybe none quite as kind of dramatic as NatCon.
No, it was actually an incredible day, and I remember walking around the venue, which was, what was it, like a ballroom, a wedding venue, converted then into the scene of sort of not a political rally, but a political ideas forum. Yeah, converted in barely 12 or 14 hours after we got the cancellation from the second venue. An incredible job by the owner. And as a journalist, a story like that is fantastic. It had everything, like the idea of like the police trying to barge in, you guys standing at the front door going, no, you can't come in here. It's a private event. You're not invited. Sorry, chaps. So then, there was at one point, one of your colleagues, I can't remember who it was now, but it was one of them, it was maybe John, was sort of holding a de facto press conference outside, and it was being broadcast live on Sky News back in the UK. And I get a phone call from our news desk being like, Joe, there's a huddle going on. It's being broadcast on Sky News. What's being said? And I went, I don't know. I'm in the huddle, and turned around and saw the camera, and they're like, oh, you're on telly. We'll hang up now. But it was, as a journalist, those stories are brilliant. The story wrote itself. You had sort of you might not agree with them, but there was loads of brilliant public speakers at this event, from say Nigel Farage, Viktor Orbán, lots of others. And it was sort of a really interesting story. And I can't remember the chap's name, but who was the guy who owned the venue?
Mr. Ben. Yeah.
Mr. Ben. Yeah. But what a courageous guy. And he came and he agreed to speak to a few journalists, and I was in that group, and he spoke very eloquently in French, saying about how that, while he might not agree with what's being said in the venue, he actually is a strong believer in freedom of speech. And actually that's quite an admirable sort of trait to have as a human being, I think, especially when it was look, it wasn't violent. There wasn't any bad people there causing trouble. Well, those were sort of people potentially outside. Who knows? Yeah. But yeah, it was fantastic. And I will always remember the pictures on your faces when I'm walking past going, oh, this is great fun, chaps. And you're like, no, it's not.
I maintain I had a smile on my face for most of those 2 days. But I mean, and then that set the tone. We'll get into the EP elections in a minute, but in the run up to the elections, there was this widespread kind of elite hysteria which has reared its head again in regards to Romania, but about the role of basically free speech, what they call social media or Russian influence, that was going to supposedly determine the course of the European parliamentary election. So this worry about free speech and free expression is kind of been a real theme for the elites this year, Frank.
It is, because as far as they're concerned, they get to decide what can and cannot be said. And the way they look at it is that, they learned a very important lesson, which is that they can manage the legacy media, they can manage the communication of news on the television, but they cannot manage what people see on the social media. And that's why, in particular, they've invented this fantasy of Russian and other influencers essentially spreading all kinds of lies and fake news, which has got to be regulated. But if you actually scratch the surface, you realize that their concept of fake news and disinformation are really statements with which they disagree. That's all that it really is. And I think there's an element of both dishonesty and self-deception on their part. If you just jump ahead, we have to remember that as bad as NatCon was, what's even worse in many ways is what happened in Germany later on, where in Germany, according to new laws that came in 2021, they can basically criminalize and take to court individuals who call politicians idiots or criticize them on the grounds that it interferes with the politicians' work. And since in the last few years, something like 1,400 people have been taken to court for making the most mildest of criticism, for doing what in England we used to call heckling, just ordinary old-fashioned heckling, which is now ground for shutting you down and putting you in prison.
Yeah. Joe, we accept you from the legacy media tag, but this kind of war on free speech really was beginning to kick into gear, and following on from the passing of the DSA and other legislation, but in the run-up to the parliamentary elections.
And I think, so you had the European parliamentary elections, but you also had on the same day the Belgian elections, and Vlaams Belang, the Belgian, considered the far-right party in Belgium, they were on the rise. They were polling really well, and the mayors who ended up trying to shut down NatCon were essentially left-wing socialists who were really concerned that these people were speaking for Vlaams Belang, which wasn't the case. They were sort of speaking just for conservatism and conservative thoughts in general. But you can see why through the whole period of this year, because as we were speaking just before we came onto the podcast, like the mainstream parties were all taking a kicking in these elections, and it is all sort of the whether it be the far left or the far right, the sort of the moniker that's used for these parties, they're the ones that are making headway in elections now. So Nigel Farage and Reform in the UK, lots of people, whether they be in the Conservative Party or Labour Party, will try and bandy him and his colleagues far right. Probably not the case, really, is it? But yeah, it seems to be the fact that people are just losing control of conversation, and it's actually affecting them at the ballot box, which is why we're sort of seeing these weird crackdowns wherever they happen. Yeah.
So then on to the European parliamentary elections, something we covered very closely. It was a very interesting few-day period for us as we were getting results in and things like that. But in many ways, this was what we thought would maybe finally be a little bit of a wake-up call to European elites. How did you digest the election results, Frank?
Well, I think the election results are part of a trend that kind of kicked in, I think it began about 10, 15 years ago, where gradually parties that have been historically marginalized and even criminalized as being fascistic or far-right are gradually getting more and more traction. And new parties that are entirely new are kind of coming to the forefront and gaining a lot of influence. I think you can see that the election showed the wave of the future. The results, weren't overwhelmingly radical in the sense of representing a rupture with what has gone on beforehand. But it basically meant that the unacceptable or dissident right, which the EU bureaucracy really dislikes, have done pretty well to kind of move forward. And they're in a much stronger position today than they would have been before the election. But the balance hasn't shifted decisively in Parliament for a number of reasons. And I think to that extent, the way that I would interpret it is that these elections mark a prelude to something that's going to grow and grow and grow over the next couple of years. I would expect the elections next year, to continue the trend, and that the number of anti-establishment parties will grow, and they will have more representatives, particularly at the national level. And I think that the old EU establishment understands that their way of life is not fundamentally called into question, as long as people have the possibility of democratic decision-making.
Yeah, we talked about the Greens, but other things to pick up from the election, Joe, as Frank has alluded to, in many ways, the kind of stranglehold of the centre, especially represented by the EPP, was in some kind of perverse way almost reinforced by the elections. But what was your reaction when the votes came in?
Well, for one thing, it was the first European election without British representation or participation, which was quite interesting for us because we would, as a Brussels correspondent, I would hammer the desk being like, oh, we need to go here to do a dispatch. We need to go here. And they were like, oh, no one's interested, Joe. Come the elections when the first polling comes out and Olaf Scholz is facing, or the Socialist Party in Germany's largest ever electoral defeat. You've got Macron is heading to sort of political oblivion. And it's what those results did. Yes, it reinforced, you've got this, I think we're going to go into the cordon sanitaire later, the idea that the centrist EPP, Socialist Democrats, Renew, that bloc is still by far the biggest in the European Parliament, and that's not changed. But it has set in a sort of a train of events which have basically seen Emmanuel Macron's government become, what's the word?
The whole Fifth Republic called into question.
Yeah, exactly. Like he's like he is really on rocky ground. But also Olaf Scholz in Germany is sort of now facing a huge election defeat, and that's sort of very problematic for them. And it was the European elections were the first sort of warning shots for what was to come. Yeah.
And I mean, one of the most obvious things that really came out of the election, Frank, was obviously the establishment of the Patriots for Europe group. I think I'm really surprised a lot of people, not just in the size of the bloc they were able to form, but the impact that they've had subsequently and beginning to really kind of forge a kind of sense of common purpose among these often kind of disparate parties.
Yes, I think that was a very positive result for the parties concerned, that they had more freedom of maneuver just because they were now a bloc. And from what I can tell, they've developed very close relationship with each other. They collaborate reasonably closely. Many of them are very new to the parliament, so they're learning on the job. But in terms of the pressure they're able to exert, that's quite considerable. So we have this interesting development occurring where from time to time what happens is that the Patriots join with the ERC and with the EPP, these different kind of centrist and right-wing groups against the left. And in a number of instances, they managed to get a decisive vote on it, which is rather unexpected. I would expect the Patriot group will be growing. More and more parties will join it, and more individual MEPs will join it over the next 18 months. I think that's for sure. After talking to people, they're all looking to move and find some kind of new home for them. And that indicates that the parties that are labeled the far right are able to, despite attempts to exclude them from any kind of influence, are able to be more than just pressure groups, but are able to act in a much more effective and decisive way.
Yeah, that's the point, isn't it, Joe? That whatever the howls of outrage from the kind of the traditional centrist parties about the existence of the hard right, the far right, the ultra right, whatever they want to call it, that it's now such a force, especially in European parliamentary politics, that they're forced to take into account.
Giorgia Meloni in Italy, before she rose to power, was considered fascist or from a post-fascist party. Now she is sort of the darling of Europe, and Ursula von der Leyen, when she needs some troubleshooting done, will go to Rome all of a sudden. So these people, maybe it's a tactic from centrists, is to sort of to hug someone they would call a baddie in a past life, to bring them into the centre and try and make them into pliable shapes. But now actually, like, it's made them quite powerful. And so when there was problems with Viktor Orban on some Ukraine policy, the first person that Ursula von der Leyen went to was Meloni, and in exchange, Meloni got harder rhetoric on migration. She got harder rhetoric on net zero and stuff. So it's the centre needs these people, because that is sort of the way they view the world, as a lot of the voters do at the moment, at this moment in time. So they can't just discard them, and they actually need to find ways to bring them in and work together, I guess. And that's what I think is going to be interesting when it comes to the European parliamentary groups. Further on into the mandate, we're obviously very early days at the moment, but how are you going to, the right is going to come together on certain green policies, but it's going to be fractional on things like Ukraine. So it's how do they mold themselves together and actually start influencing large scale?
Yeah, and I mean, Joe's already mentioned it, but this also kicked into gear the cordon sanitaire, which has been a real theme, the intensification of the cordon sanitaire, not just in kind of Europe, EP politics, but right across the continent. And the kind of default setting is in everywhere now, despite if there's a election wing, as we saw for the kind of success of anti-systemic forces in Germany, for example, especially in Eastern Germany, or in the French election that we can talk about. But the everywhere the answer is the cordon sanitaire, and there's this increasingly desperate attempt, isn't there, Frank, to trying to draw a line between the respectable and the kind of irrespectable forces in European politics.
Yeah, I mean, the cordon sanitaire is an attempt to ignore the political wishes of the people that voted for certain parties, to delegitimate those kinds of democratic decisions that were taken by the voters. And to that extent, it's an unusually authoritarian formula that's being used. I think that the days of the cordon sanitaire are gone. I would expect it gradually eroding in terms of its influence. And you can see signs of that. Here in Belgium, for example, Vlaams Belang, which has always been excluded from any kind of office, even though it's one of the largest parties, or I think is the largest party in Flanders. They finally managed to be accepted in some of the smaller towns as mayors, and are supported by other parties, which is completely unprecedented given the fierce opposition to them being allowed to play a legitimate political role. Finding that Germany it's coming to the point at which there are these weird coalitions being created that involve the CDU, the Socialist, and Sarah Wagenknecht's left-wing populist parties. But that's a very kind of fragile kind of alliance that cannot really kind of continue indefinitely, given the big differences that they all possessed. I think that after the German election, especially if the AfD does, as expected, and in addition, some of the other elections that we're seeing, if the right does as well as the opinion polls show, it will become much more difficult to maintain this kind of wall, this quarantine that's been imposed on these political parties. And I would expect that by the time this parliament in the European Union is come to an end, that the cordon sanitaire will not be able to hold, but instead new alignments will come to the fore. And in the end, pragmatism and opportunism will trump the attempt to quarantine certain kinds of parties. Yeah.
And then the next event, I guess we need to talk about, Joe, and one is kind of thing that was actually subject in some ways to the cordon sanitaire was the Hungarian presidency, which kind of kicked off in grand fashion with Orban announcing it's time to make Europe great again, and that's sending howls of indignation among the kind of usual suspects. How have you assessed the record of the Hungarian presidency?
It's been much like any other presidency. People don't like Hungarian politicians for many, many reasons here in Brussels. But actually, a lot of the diplomatic staff are sort of very ardent Europeans, and they're not the ones who are leaking documents. They're not the ones who are sort of mischief making as much as other governments. So actually, they run a steady ship. I was actually in the US, so I missed their European Political Community Summit, which was held at the Puskás Stadium. So I'm very jealous because I would have quite liked to have gone and looked around as a football fan. But everyone has given it rave reviews. They said like how well organised it was and stuff like that. So yes, on one hand, you have like the reason people don't like Viktor Orban because like his views on Ukraine or his views on Russia, like the fact that he happens to use Europe and the European Union to deliver for his voters. But there's a reason that he keeps on getting elected. It's because obviously people are happy with him. Look, there can't be any complaints. And people have, like, you speak to people around town and they say they've been as professional as any other presidency. So I don't think it's been the sort of the shock and awe sort of change in mentality that Viktor Orban sort of promised to make Europe great again. It's been a very steady ship.
Yeah. Well, one exception to that, Frank, which I agree with Joe, but one exception, and then we'll come to Ursula von der Leyen's re-election, if you can call it an election, or reconfirmation. But the kind of key moment for me that defined maybe that part of the year was that showdown that we talked about extensively on this podcast between Orban and kind of newly empowered von der Leyen in the European Parliament. But that reflected just the enormous splits that exist in European politics.
Well, I think it did, because what it showed was that despite the very professional way in which the Hungarian diplomatic service and the civil service carried out the functions that needed to be carried out during the presidency, there was a continuous attempt to try to sabotage the Hungarian presidency, particularly at the level of optics, to make sure that they did whatever possible to humiliate the Hungarian government, particularly to humiliate Viktor Orban. And the kind of language and the way in which some of the political leaders in the EU oriented towards Orban and tried to kind of put him down and make him feel small really indicates the kind of animosity. It's almost like kind of quasi-ideological animosity they have towards the Hungarian government. And I thought that Orban handled that really well. If I was in his place, I would have lost my cool. But he was fairly humorous and fairly flexible in the way that he responded to it, and did not allow himself to be put into a corner and did not allow himself to be isolated. I thought that exchange that occurred was historically very, very important, because it tells us that the supposedly neutral leadership of the European Commission is anything but.
Yeah. And Joe, I mean, people were taking stock of Ursula von der Leyen's first term and talking about the way in which she'd kind of slowly transformed the role of the Commission presidents into something else. But then that really kind of became obvious when it was time for kind of VDL 2.0 and the formation of her, of the actual Commission as a whole. Even Politico, right, were forced to concede that this is like an enormous power grab by Queen Ursula. It wasn't just she was no longer just the kind of sitting in the middle. It was in fact an enormous paragraph, no?
Well, you only had this weird dynamic and row between her and Charles Michel constantly about who is the most powerful European Union official, which I always thought was quite strange. You had, what was that, Sofagate? I can't remember when that was, when they sat down and she was forced to sit on a sofa instead of a chair next to Erdogan. But you've always had that weird dynamic, and she was hired as sort of, when she was put forward as this shock name, she was the German defense minister at the time when she first sort of was nominated as European Commission president, I think by Emmanuel Macron. And she was seen as a safe pair of hands that is going to allow European leaders a bit more control over the European Union again, sort of at the council level, because they'd had these big beasts in Donald Tusk and Jean-Claude Juncker in the last term, the last mandate, so prior to von der Leyen's previous mandate. And they wanted a bit more power back. But she is subsequently set herself on this path to trying to make herself a Queen Ursula sort of figure. She always pictures herself as a geopolitical commission president when the commission doesn't actually have any foreign policy power. And she's really trying to grab on that. And she's trying to lead reviews of the defense industries across Europe and stuff, which is traditionally NATO's job. But she's trying to make this a European issue. And it's possibly because actually she is struggling to actually identify areas where the European Commission actually has sort of a mandate where it is allowed to intervene in European politics. And she's constantly crossing that threshold. And she was sort of single-handedly trying to push through Ukraine's accession process and actually making them an accession candidate and opening those negotiations single-handedly. She was really pushing that. There was lots of European leaders for various reasons who didn't want it to start so quickly.
Yeah.
And she sort of made that a real sort of priority and strong point. So she's gone from the European Commission should be a quiet ship, civil service operating in the background, to she is this leading light, the face of Europe. And I'm not sure that's going to go down well with a lot of leaders when they realise actually our sovereignty is being breached here a little bit.
Yeah, well, and to tie back into, we've touched on them, but maybe to tie them back in, the the kind of political void opening up in France and Germany as a result of the electoral defeats suffered there. But is it the case, Frank, that as especially those two like enormous, really important parts of Europe and the European Union, when they're kind of politically at sea, it becomes almost a kind of natural, almost an organic process by which power then accumulates more almost by default to the Commission, because there's such a kind of headlessness at the heart of some of these important countries?
Yeah, I mean, you have to remember that most of the governments in West Europe often use the European Commission or the EU as a medium through which they can make decisions. It's almost like the outsourced decision-making from the national sort of domestic field to the EU, because that's the way that they can avoid taking responsibility for these kinds of decisions. Or alternatively, they say we have no choice but to exact this kind of economic or other kind of policy, because otherwise we run into trouble against some financial rule or something else that the EU has imposed on us. So I think there's this kind of interesting relationship where in the end, the European Union and its institutions serves as a kind of as a safety net for their own political problems, and I think that's going to kind of continue. I think it's just to go back to what we discussed earlier on. I would also argue that the reason why Queen Ursula is the queen isn't simply because of her ambition and her ruthless approach towards public life. It's because the other politicians desperately are looking around for some form of authority, some way in which things can continue in the old kind of way. And it's a testimony to the feeble political status of the leaders of Europe, that there isn't anybody else that could, in a sense, rise to the occasion and play that kind of a role. And I think that there's a kind of a symbiotic relationship between the weak political elites within the nation states and their commitment to allowing the EU and the people that are running the Commission far more influence and power than they would have otherwise.
Yeah. And so moving on then, I mean, if one event really shook up world politics, European politics, when it happened, it was the election of Donald Trump. How was that received here, Joe? Because it's been kind of interesting that it wasn't quite the outright hysteria that we had the first time Trump was elected. And almost there's a kind of, I mean, we've seen examples of, I would say, almost sycophancy from European leaders. They're all scrambling around. Are they going to fund more to NATO? Are they going to, Macron's off trying to establish some kind of task force to send to Ukraine to relieve the Americans of any job there? How have they kind of reacted to this?
Well, I was actually in America when it happened, so I wasn't at some sort of Brussels watch party late into the night. But the European reaction has been interesting, and they've actually been planning for it for a long time. You have this in NATO. You were speaking about this idea of Trump-proofing. Mm-hmm. Part of that was let's get Mark Rutte in as Secretary General. He's a guy that's got a good relationship with Trump. He's faced down Trump before. The idea is let's pander to Trump's sort of demands when it comes to spending more on defense in Europe. That's something that he's spoken about a lot, but it's not just Donald Trump. It's every American president. Mm-hmm. Sort of Barack Obama, who was meant to be a friend of Europe, would say that Europe didn't spend enough on defense. You tell him how great he is and how right he is and how you're going to buy American products. Do you remember Jean-Claude Juncker went and gave him a hug and promised to buy more soybeans off America in exchange for not levying tariffs on European aluminium and steel exports. So I think they've always seen the need to plan for this scenario, and it's not really a shock anymore. Where it was a shock, though, was in Washington. So I spent 2 months there before the election, and every time I was in Washington, people would go, the American public, they've made this mistake once before. They're not stupid enough to do it again. They really aren't. This guy was horrendous, he's an idiot, whatever sort of words that the bubble would use to criticize Donald Trump. But then every time I traveled outside of DC, whether it be just across the river to Virginia, or I went to North Carolina to Asheville, Swannanoa, which had been hit by Hurricane Helene terribly. And basically everyone outside of the bubble, the political bubble of DC would tell me, oh no, Trump's our guy, he's going to win really comfortably. But then I'd go back into DC into sort of the bars and coffee shops and be convinced that Kamala Harris was going to win. And when I was then given the job of being the Telegraph journalist at Kamala Harris's election night party at Howard University.
You were there.
I was there,
Yeah.
so I'll tell you a bit about that because it was sort of hilarious. I thought I was going to witness history. I thought I was going to see a presidential speech from the first elected female president of the US. But then, so on the hour, every hour, basically from about 8 p.m, they would offer a CNN screen would be blasted onto big screens around the venue. And then at 11 p.m, the, what's his name? Is it Jonathan King? I think it's Jonathan King. The CNN anchor of the evening, sort of legendary anchor. He basically said, I would rather be Donald Trump than Kamala Harris at this moment in time. And it went from sort of flag waving, singing and dancing to like crying, hugging. The flags all dropped on the floor. People started fleeing for the exits. And then I was like, I've got to hang around a little bit longer just in case she gives her concession speech, because she's clearly, like even the New York Times, I think at that point on their little dial had said it was a 95% chance that Trump was winning. And then one of her campaign officials came onto the stage and was like, but as he was being walked onto the stage, a lady to my right shouted, "Oh my God, it's Hillary all over again," because Hillary Clinton famously didn't come out and give her concession speech on the evening and didn't address the public in 2016. So yeah, really, really sort of interesting. But what it did teach me, and I came back and wrote a dispatch of my time in America, is how wrong political bubbles are. And it keeps on happening. In Brussels, we always thought the far right, the hard right, whatever we want to call them, weren't going to make gains or weren't going to have a meaningful impact. But they did. They've managed to sort of shake up politics in France and Germany. So sort of the Franco-German axis is it's not very stable anymore.
And Frank, we held a conference on, we've published a little bit on how Trump has really shaken things up here in Europe. Is it the case that Trump's win's emboldened similar kind of forces across Europe, the nightmare scenario of the political center? Or what kind of impetus has Trump's win given in Europe?
Well, it's interesting because you can't Trump-proof the world. You can Trump-proof the institutions, but in a sense, you can't really do very much to insulate public life from what has happened there. And what the Trump election did was to give far more confidence to many of these populist parties. They actually think that they are the future, that what happened in the United States represents a model that they can emulate. They're all talking now in a language and in a manner that exudes far more confidence than they had, prior to Trump's election. And I think that one of the consequences of this will be that it will lead to the public raising far more questions about what they hear on the media. They will become far more skeptical about opinion polls, far more skeptical about the usual elite narrative about what's happening. And I think that I would say that the election of Donald Trump, and in terms of its impact, is far greater this time around than back in 2016, because this time around, his success converges with the political dynamic in the nation states of Europe much more closely. It's much more kind of, there's a much closer synergy there. And I would expect that because of Trump, just the very fact that he gives confidence to these parties is going to lead to a very positive result for parties that identify with his victory.
Well, we've done extensively the two kind of most recent, as we're recording this, major events, the annulment of the election in Romania and the kind of hysteria around TikTok. And also we've touched on the collapse of the Barnier government in France. I don't necessarily want to dwell on those, but I want to look ahead. Right. We've almost not touched on geopolitics at all. We've been talking, and yet the situation is becoming ever more fractious. And we've talked about worries around escalation. The economic situation in Europe seems to me increasingly uncertain, especially in some of the big countries like France and Germany. But at the same time, there is this brewing kind of populist energy. So, Joe, looking into next year, we're no crystal balls, but what do you think of some of the dynamics? Is this something that we should be concerned about, or are there kind of reasons for at least a little bit of hope as well?
There's always reasons for hope, and we hopefully will get some sort of peace agreement in Ukraine that stops sort of innocent people being killed and buildings being destroyed and stuff like that. That's one thing you can hope for. But I guess the main thing we can hope for is people actually use 2024 as a learning exercise, and sort of like the Conservative Party in the UK, the Democrats in the US realise, and well, actually then people who are now in power, Donald Trump has to realise this, the Labour Party have to realise this, anyone in power has to realise the reason that people are voting for sort of these non-mainstream parties, the fringe parties, is because the mainstream isn't seen to deliver anymore. Like we've gone, like in America, everyone would sort of point to the cost of fuel going up from $3 to $5 a gallon or something like that. Like food in Europe has gotten more expensive, the cost of a pint and stuff like that. Just the simple luxuries that we enjoy as human beings, the more expensive they get, sort of the more we see politicians not delivering, that's going to mean the more of us will reach for these fringes who are offering maybe a more radical view on how to fix things rather than sort of the mainstream approach, which is very similar these days, whether you're a Conservative or a Labour Party politician in the UK, because you don't offer that much different. And if it doesn't work, then people are going to go elsewhere.
Yeah, Frank, what are you expecting, worried about, looking forward to over the next year?
Well, I'm worried about the global economy, because the kind of problems that exist globally, and more specifically within Europe, cannot be fixed in the short run. They require kind of long-term investment, so they require an imaginative orientation towards the economic life of different nations, which at the moment is sorely lacking. I don't see any of the governments even acknowledging the scale of the problem that they have within Europe. So that's a huge problem. As Joe said, the economy in terms of its impact on people is going to get, if anything, worse. So I do worry about that. I kind of worry about the geopolitical situation, because it's unusually unstable. And it's in many ways, it reminds me as a historian of the decades leading up to the First World War, where the alignment between different nations was very fluid, and it was very unclear who would be with, which side. And at the moment, when you have the Middle East being so unstable and the war in the Ukraine still continuing, and I think that even if there's a peace treaty or a ceasefire, it's going to be only temporary, because a lot of instability has been put in place. So, that's not going to be solved. So there's a kind of instability and a lack of balance on a global scale. Where I'm optimistic is that what's called the fringe parties are going to be less on the fringe and more within the center of public life. I cannot imagine how the mainstream parties can revitalize themselves. When you look at the Conservative Party in England, when you look at the CDU in Germany or the Republicans in France, they are not parties anymore in the classical sense. Even the Labour Party kind of fits that bill. They haven't got that kind of dynamic. They haven't got what Trump had, which is a movement, a genuine movement that allowed the Republicans to kind of move forward. That does not exist. That grassroots commitment doesn't really exist. And the quality of the politicians that are attracted to these parties is unusually low when you look around, who are the individuals we're talking about. So I think that, where I'm optimistic is that I expect the legitimation crisis of these parties to be far greater. And I would expect many of these new parties to be more, potentially quite successful. I mean, I think of a party like Reform, which was just born, almost like overnight. And you look at them now, and, I know where I have a house in England where locally Reform has just won, one county seat and one local government seat. And it's not even mentioned in the newspapers. Nobody who reads the mainstream newspapers would realize that they're picking up seats and are getting a lot of support locally. And that kind of development is actually good news. Whatever you think of their politics, it's really good news, because the revitalization of democratic politics is not going to come from the mainstream parties somehow reinventing themselves, but it's going to come about through some other means.
Yeah. So, Joe, I mean, it's Christmas after all. To throw in a kind of Christmas theme to this, if you were looking back and you were in the position of Father Christmas this year, who would be kind of on your naughty list and who would be on the nice list?
Naughty list would be whoever invented the idea of bundling together lists of people at the end of the year. I was flicking through knowing this question was coming, and I Googled, like, what have people done this year? And then I just got, who is the top cryptocurrency influencer of 2024? Who is the biggest social media influencer? Who is the best sportsman of 2024? And I was like, you know what, I don't. So,
resistant to the end to the BuzzFeedization of politics, yeah.
The naughty list, I guess you'd go Emmanuel Macron. He's a president of a country, but has now got very little power. And he's managed to make a decision he didn't have to, almost in... I remember sitting in the European Parliament when he gave that sort of speech to say he was going to call an election in response to Marine Le Pen doing very well in the European elections. And we were just all a bit puzzled why he did that, and basically sort of lent to the same argument that Emmanuel Macron is sort of overconfident in his abilities. And actually, I then interviewed Michel Barnier a couple of days afterwards, and he was sort of ranting down the telephone going, oh, what an idiot this guy is. He's led us to our Frexit moment. He has suffered from what people in, like, what the Remain campaign in Britain suffered for during Brexit, where they failed to address people's sort of dwindling standards, failed to take into consideration people's concerns over things like immigration and sovereignty.
Yeah.
And Macron has now, plunged himself into, well, not the end of the Fifth Republic, probably, but like he's called it into question.
So Macron gets coal. Who's getting something nice?
God, this is a tricky one. I don't think any politicians. I really hate politicians.
You can give it to Frank if you like.
Frank, obviously, but
thank you.
I'm going to give mine to Arne Slot, the Liverpool manager. Not only because I support Liverpool, but I think actually politicians should sort of like take heed of what he's done, because you often get people will come into a new job. He was succeeding Jurgen Klopp, this big beast of football, big beast of Liverpool, sort of someone that was loved, and everyone sort of thought he was going to do pretty badly compared to what Jurgen Klopp had done over the years. But he is actually Liverpool top of the Premier League, top of this new Champions League. And he's done it very quietly and assertively. And he's basically shown that if you deliver, people will like you. So maybe people should learn from the Arne Slot mentality.
Well, if we start the MCC Brussels Sports Podcast, we'll start, the two of you could do this, I think, alone. But Frank, I won't ask you the same, but instead, I mean, the time of year we're around, Christmas, is hugely important for Europe. It's like so central to the cultural, historical, even political and religious kind of destiny and history of Europe. What are you reflecting on at Christmas time?
Well, I reflect on the fact that there is a project afoot to somehow cancel Christmas. Not cancel Christmas because you can't, but by arguing that Christmas is too exclusive. It doesn't include everybody, who's not Christian. And therefore, instead of saying Merry Christmas, we should say Merry Holidays or Happy Holidays. And that's happening in France, in a number of other kind of countries. And although this is, not that serious a problem, it does reflect something within our culture that we overlook the fact that there's something special and magical about Christmas. And contrary to what they're saying about being not inclusive or somehow keeping people out, what Christmas is really all about is binding people together. It's one of the few times when all of us feel that kind of special feeling. And in a sense, it creates a kind of connection individually, because all of us remember what Christmas was like when we were children. We all remember those kind of magical moments that make us really look forward to something as being special. But also what's very important is that the connection that it creates between generations, within a family, are also very important in the roots that it has already established within European culture, because Christmas and the kind of religious and its cultural dimensions are ones that are the defining feature of what it means to be European. And it's important for us to realize that unless we take care of our roots, unless we cultivate our roots, which is what we're doing in Christmas, regardless of whether you're religious or not, unless we kind of take that a little bit more seriously, we risk losing something special, one of the few things in our lives that creates kind of cultural solidarity and brings people together. And that's why I think that it isn't just simply a question of loving Christmas and enjoying what's happening and, looking forward to coming together within our families and with our friends, but it's also to reflect on the fact that it is something that's a bit bigger than just a holiday. So because it isn't just a holiday, it's something, it's a statement, it's an experience about a way of life. And I think that way of life is really well worth cherishing.
Yeah, well, we'll be using the time at MCC Brussels to think and reflect and read and also relax and enjoy ourselves. But it's going to be a hugely busy year to come next year, which we're excited that you'll join us with. So for now, from us on the MCC Brussels podcast, Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. Thank you.
Yeah.